This video is on evidence for evolution. The things below provide evidence for the theory of evolution. The first piece of evidence we're going to discuss is fossil evidence. When we look at fossil evidence, we can see structural changes over time. And remember, evolution is the idea of change over time in a population. So if we see evidence of structural changes over time, then we're actually showing evidence for evolution or changes over time. And you can actually date fossils using two methodologies. One is called using their relative age, or where they fit in the fossil record, like in the layers of rocks. You can also date them using radioactive carbon or rocks using radioactive potassium and look for their absolute age based on half-life. So fossils provide excellent evidence for evolution, although of course there are some gaps in the fossil record, fossils we haven't found yet, things like that. The second piece of evidence for evolution is something that's broadly called morphology. And when I say morphology, I mean structures. So I'm looking at structures. And the three structures I'm going to look at under morphology are homologous structures, analogous structures, and vestigial structures. And we can actually see these below. The first structure we'll look at is something called a homologous structure. A homologous structure is a structure that shows similarities with evolved differences. For instance, this human, the cat, the whale, and the bat all have one upper arm bone, known as the humerus. They all have two lower arm bones, known as the radius and the ulna. And they all have many lower hand and wrist bones, known as like the carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. However, you can see while they have the same bones, so those bones are considered homologous structures, the structures of the bones themselves have changed slightly, which has led to different functions, right? So you can see a homologous structure is a structure that has a similar structure but evolved differences. So here we have similar bones with evolved differences. So same structure, but often different functions. Homologous structures show evidence for evolution because there is a common ancestor. So the human, the cat, the whale, and the bat had a common ancestor that was the same and had the similar bone structure, and then they evolved differences. This is known as divergent evolution. And this is a type of evidence for evolution because you have a change over time from one species to many different species. Okay. The way I remember this, like the way I remember that homologous structures and divergent evolution go together is HD. Homologous structures go with divergent evolution. Okay. If you have one common ancestor and many different species evolved, that's known as adaptive radiation. So I just want to write that kind of key term down while we're going over an example. So adaptive radiation is when you have one common ancestor. And from now on, I'm going to shorten common ancestors to CA, just by the way. One common ancestor, which is evolved into many different species. A good example of this are Darwin's finches. Okay, so homologous structures are a type of morphology that shows change over time. A second example we can look at is this one up here, these analogous structures. So this right here shows you analogous structure. An analogous structure is a different structure with the same function. So for example, all of these are like the function is for flight, but the makeup of the wing structure is different. So in analogous structures, they do not have a common ancestor. However, they had similar environmental pressures, which has led to a similar adaptation. So no common ancestors, but they evolved to look the same. This is known as convergent evolution. You can see this in wings, right? We have feathers, we have membranes, we have kind of more of a keratinized tissue, right? And they've evolved to have the same function, okay? And I remember that these go together because analogous structures and convergent evolution, it's always nice to have AC in the summer, okay? Okay, vestigial structures are structures that are no longer in use. For example, our appendix, a whale's pelvis, where they would have like legs attached, they don't use those anymore. So vestigial structures show evidence for evolution because it's a structure that used to have a function and a need in the body and no longer does, change over time. The third piece of evidence for evolution we're looking at is biochemical. When I say biochemical, I'm talking about DNA similarities and differences and protein similarities and differences, right? So I'm talking about things that are conserved. So if it's conserved, and if you remember, conserved means more similar. If the DNA proteins are conserved or more similar, we have a closer common ancestor, right? So for example, down here, you can see this DNA evidence. Actually, this is amino acid evidence. They've done a protein comparison here, and you can see here is part of the amino acid sequence of hemoglobin, which is a protein that transports oxygen in a human, a horse, a gorilla, a chimpanzee, and a zebra. And you can see here's the human's code: lysine, glutamate, histidine, isoleucine, right? It's very different from a horse. It's more similar to a gorilla, right? There's 3 of the 4 in common. It's not very similar to the zebra, but the chimpanzee, it's an exact match. So humans are most closely related to, right, chimpanzees. And you can see that because the human's amino acid sequence and the chimpanzee's amino acid sequence is the same. So they have a common ancestor there, a more recent common ancestor. Now, that doesn't mean that a human came from a chimpanzee, like a chimpanzee turned into a human. It means they would have a common ancestor and then they branched off. So here would be the common ancestor, and then there was a branch, and you get humans, and a branch, you get chimps. Okay. All right. The last piece of evidence for evolution we're talking about up here is right up here is biogeography. Biogeography is looking at how the continents moved like we're talking about like Pangea separating and species distribution. So it's studying the bio, the life on different continents, and relating that back to geography, or where the different continents are located. So that's right down here. This is biogeography, right? Pangea was when all the continents were together, and then they separated. There was continental drift. And so we had something called geographic isolation, meaning common ancestor populations were separated from each other and continued evolving. And that led to speciation, or the evolution of new species. And again, this shows you evidence for evolution, because if these all had a common ancestor, right? If the ostrich and the emu and the ray and all of these had a common ancestor, and then the ostrich was separated, and the common ancestor, some of them were in Africa, some of them were in South America, some of them were in Papua New Guinea, some of them were in New Zealand, some of them were in Australia. All of these common ancestors were separated to these different locations. They couldn't get to each other. They were physically separated by the ocean. So this population couldn't breed with this population. They both developed different mutations, and over time they became their own species. So the common ancestor branched out to all these different species. And again, this shows changes in populations over time. And in this case, the changes were so vast that you got a new species. I hope you enjoyed this video on evidence for evolution. Thanks for watching.